Good morning. Oh, I don't know, when I hear 5th grade and up called for shoko, it's almost like punishment, huh? Huh. See, kindergarten, 1st grade, up to 3rd grade, I don't hear that. Sometimes I even hear, yes! But I'd like to welcome everyone to the last Sunday for the month of March. This year, 2014, is really zipping by, and in just 2 days, we'll begin the month of April. Yay! Huh? And of course, with the coming of every April, we celebrate the birth of the historical Shakyamuni Buddha with our annual Hanamatsuri service. This year, our Hanamatsuri service will be on Sunday, April 13th, 2014. Not long ago, Gail Keikoan gave me an interesting article to read. It seems that last year, archaeologists were excavating the site of Lumbini, where the Buddha was born. And the archaeologists discovered evidence that the historical Shakyamuni Buddha might actually have lived as much as 2 centuries earlier than previously considered. That would mean that the Buddha would have lived over 2,700 years ago. 2,700 years ago. This is a great discovery for archaeologists, and to consider that our tradition may actually be 2 centuries older than previously thought, this would no doubt create some interesting discussion among religious historians. But to a Buddhist, to we who are on the Dharma path, such a discovery really matters very little. The reason for this is that Buddhism is not based on the life of Siddhartha, who became the historical Shakyamuni Buddha. Although we celebrate his birth, and we celebrate his enlightenment, and we memorialize his death, what has always been considered of real importance in Buddhism is the Dharma. It's the Dharma. I still remember as a young student of Buddhism, one of my teachers, Dr. Taitetsu Unno, once said in a class, if a time machine were to be invented, and if in going back in time it was discovered that there was no such person as Siddhartha or the Shakyamuni Buddha, he said, it would affect Buddhism not at all. Isn't that interesting? He said, going back to discover this would not affect Buddhism at all. The reason Dr. Unno said this is because Buddhism is not centered around an individual or a historical personality. What is really important and what has always been essential is the Dharma. When we hear the story of the historical Shakyamuni Buddha, he is never considered to have invented or created the Dharma. The title Buddha, as most of you know, literally means one who is awake, one whose eyes are open. In the story of Siddhartha, he awakened to the reality of seeing things just as they are. This was his enlightenment. And what Siddhartha, what the Shakyamuni Buddha awakened to, is called the Dharma. As many of you know, in the greatest meaning of the word Dharma, it means universal truth, seeing things just as they are. Dharma, most simply, is just universal truth. And in the story of the Buddha, when the Buddha was dying, with his last words, he said to his disciples, in living your lives, in living life, let the Dharma be your guide. Let truth be your guide. As he was dying, the Buddha did not pick a successor. He didn't say, okay, I want you to follow this person over here and don't forget anything I said and don't change a thing. Instead, he said, let the truth be your guide. When Socho Ogui was bishop of BCA, he would often clarify this even further. And Socho would say, as teachers of Buddhism, he would say this to ministers. We had a group of ministers, and he said, as teachers of Buddhism, we consider the Dharma to be universal truth. Then he would add, and if the Dharma we try to teach is truly universal, then it should make sense to anyone, any place, any time, in any culture, and in any language. And if it does not, it is not universal. It is not the Dharma. I think this statement alone is a great test to see if what is being taught is truly Dharma. If it does not universally make sense, then it must not be the Dharma. And I've always liked that about Buddhism. Buddhism is not concerned from where truth comes, whether it's in the Hindu Vedas or the Buddhist Sutras, the Christian Bible or the Islamic Quran. If there is truth, it's universal. Although the archaeologists excavating the site of Lumbini have discovered artifacts that indicate the Buddha may have lived centuries earlier, ultimately and essentially, Buddhism is not rooted in any historic personality, nor should there be any absolute attachment to any historical site or artifacts that may exist. Some of you may remember that until March of 2001, in the Hindu Kush mountains of central Afghanistan, there stood the two tallest standing statues of the Buddha. These statues were over 1,700 years old, and they stood 165 and 150 feet tall. In March of 2001, there was an international outcry when the Taliban blew up these ancient statues with rockets and tank fire, and when that proved insufficient, they finally drilled holes into the statue and used dynamite to destroy them. These statues were considered a part of a World Cultural Heritage Site. At that time, I remember hearing from many Dharma friends around the country and around the world about how sad it was that there continued to be such intolerance in the world. But there was no anger and there was no outrage. In fact, from Buddhist organizations and traditions around the world, there were no expressions of anger or call for revenge. Instead, there was, I felt, a sense of bewildered sadness for the loss of two grand images from our collective world heritage, from the heritage of humanity. One of the two essential teachings of Buddhism is to awaken to the reality of impermanence. And we who are on the Dharma path, I think we are both amazed that those remarkable statues lasted for 17 centuries and saddened that their end was caused by human intolerance and pride. Not long after this took place, I remember mentioning in a Dharma message that I gave that a very dear friend of mine, Reverend Wayne Yokoyama, who lives in Japan and who is a well-known Buddhist translator, he told me that within the wreckage and debris of those statues, they discovered an ancient and previously unknown copy of the Paticca Sutra. The sutra had obviously been placed deep within the statue, most likely from the time when it was first being carved out of the mountain. And he was delighted to receive a copy from a friend, and he worked on the translation of the sutra. Reverend Yokoyama jokingly said to me, "Wow, if Buddhist scholars knew those ancient sutras were in the statues, they might have given the Taliban the dynamite to blow them up." Although Reverend Yokoyama lives in Kyoto, he was born in Hawaii, raised in Los Angeles, and his American humor is intact. I sometimes comment on this because American humor is very interesting because we joke only about the most serious things. When something is truly unacceptable or painful, or it brings within us something where we feel we can't resolve easily, within American humor, I think we've always find ourselves making fun or creating some kind of joke. But when I read his words, there was no anger, and within his humor too, there was a quiet sadness for the intolerance that continues to exist in the hearts of so many. As the Buddha emphasized himself, the only real concern is to follow the Dharma. In Buddhism, there is no absolute attachment to a physical personality or to historical artifacts or even to what might be considered a holy site. However, it is still enjoyable to celebrate what we think might be the birthday of the historical Buddha, give or take 200 years. Next month, we are very fortunate to have as our Hanamatsuri guest speaker, Reverend Peter Hatta, who has only recently been assigned to the Los Angeles Higashi Honganji Betsuin. I first met Reverend Peter Hatta over 40 years ago. At the time, he was not a minister. At the time, he was the lead guitarist of the original jazz fusion group Hiroshima. And after completing his graduate studies in music at Cal State University in Long Beach, he was invited to become a professor of music at his alma mater. And throughout these years, his interest in Buddhism also grew. And I was delighted when he completed his studies with Higashi Honganji to receive his Tokudo and his Kyoshi certification. So, let's all come out on Sunday, April 13th and welcome Reverend Peter Hatta to the best temple in BCA. Service, as you know, will be at 9:30, and this will be followed immediately with our Dharma School Hanamatsuri play written by Cliff and Ann Amioka. And I think since Jillian will be going away to college, this may be the last play directed by our graduating senior. So I hope you'll take this awareness with you. Buddhism is not based or rooted in historical personalities, and we do not have absolute attachment to artifacts or sites. Instead, the Dharma is rooted, the Buddhism is rooted in the Dharma, in the teachings of Buddhism. So please always keep this in mind. What's really important is not a person, but the Dharma tradition, the Dharma that is being taught. And as Socho Gui often said, if it doesn't make sense to anyone in any place, in any time, in any culture, in any language, then we know this is not universal truth. In closing, please join me in Gassho. What is of real importance to Buddhism is the Dharma, to wake up to the reality of impermanence and to the oneness of all things. This is the message of the Praticca Samuppada Sutra found in the debris of the Banyan Valley statues. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.